commission or the commissioner, which is the elected officials who are having an oversight on the commission. We have the general management, the deputy general managers, and the general counsel, and this layer is the strategic layer. Right below, we have the tactic layer, and it corresponds to what we call the senior leadership team, which you may know in your own organization as the directors for each respective areas. And the third layer is the operational layer, and for us it's the division, therefore right below the directors, the plants, the assets, the depot. We have some depot where we store the material, where we do the maintenance of our fleet, and the projects. So that's one approach, and the first line of defense, typically speaking, is the operational layer, where basically all the risks, let's say in the weeds, for example, I'm just picking one up. You're on a project and there's a supplier who's not performing, so you have a risk on that very project about blah, 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 blah. The second line of defense is the strategic and the tactic layers. So basically, how does it happen in practice? In practice, we have risk workshops with the divisions, the sections, the plants, the asset management team, the depot, and the project. Could be on a quarterly basis, could be on a monthly basis, could be on a monthly basis for the project, which is ideal, and could be on a quarterly basis, for example, for the plants and the depots. And the top risk for each of those areas are highlighted, if you will, and they are reported to the tactic level. So in practice, what does it mean? The top risk, for example, in a plant of a wastewater plant. Those top risks are discussed in a quarterly risk meeting with the production director, who is on the tactic level. And what does it mean then? It means that with each of the directors, we discuss the top risk for their different lanes, and those top risk for each of the tactic layer is discussed then with the strategic layer. Each of the top risk identified or recognized by the strategic layer are making the enterprise risk for the quarter. Here I have not talked about the third line of defense, because the third line of defense is always internal audit, or what we call, it's internal audit, or what we call in our organization the OIG. So the OIG is really having an oversight role, so that's typically the third line of defense. So that's one way of doing it. Do you have any question on this way of doing it?
This is Cello. I just have a quick question. So when you talk about enterprise risk, you are really talking about the risk on the strategic level. Am I wrong?
I am talking about all the top risk identified throughout the roll-up mechanism I have described. So meaning there could be an operational risk that it is seen by the tactic layers and the strategic layers as a top risk for the commission.
Oh, okay.
Example, I'm going to take an example. A couple of years ago, WSSC Water has started working on a major IT project, which was C2M. C2M is an IT systems tool, Oracle-based, in order basically to improve the billing system and also to accommodate a change in rate structure. So that was a major project for the company. Okay. So as any kind of major project, either you talk about construction project or IT projects, for example, you always have some risk. But because the amount of money involved with C2M and the visibility WSSC Water had with C2M, and because it was almost the first stop in the entire industry and actually worldwide, because only one other company had implemented C2M before, the top risk identified on C2M, at least a couple of them, had become top risk for the company.
Okay. So Elaine, this is Scott.
Yes,
just
Scott.
Another way of putting it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that in dealing with enterprise-wide risks, it could include, just because of the priorities and the, what emerges, it could be an operational risk, it could be, project risk, it could be different kinds of risks, but you're talking about creating a risk register of the leading enterprise-wide risks that could incorporate any of that. Is that right?
Absolutely, Scott. Yeah, this is absolutely correct. Last time we met, and I believe Scott Metro Vancouver was not there, but we talked about what is an enterprise risk. And thank you, Scott. It might be a good opportunity to kind of re-emphasize on the definition. Enterprise risk are the risk across the organization that are perceived as major risk in order for the organization to achieve its objective. So the inherent nature of that risk can be operational or something else. It could be your human capital. So it's really looking at all the risk that a company has and streamlining those that are really top risks. So either in terms of probability and or severity, or it could be a medium probability but a high severity, and we are going to see that with the artifact that we can work on. Yeah, so enterprise risk is a snapshot, if you will, at a certain moment in time of the top risk across the organization that are perceived as top. And they can be operational, they can be tactic, or they can be strategic. So now, for example, so again, that's just a way of doing it. And here, well, actually, I have mixed both approaches because I've mentioned the operational layer that rolls up into the tactic layer that rolls up thereafter into the strategic layer, where each top risk for each layer are brought up to the other layer up to the moment you have your top risk identified, and those are at the strategic level, become at the strategic level because they would have an impact on the objective. However, you have another way of doing it, and here I'm coming to what WSSC Water, and sorry, Ness is missing here, has done. Engaging an entire organization through this exercise that has to be recurring might be a very heavy lift, above all when the maturity and the awareness in terms of risk management is not very broad. So what you can do if you have some buy-in from your directors and your leadership is to start this exercise only first with the directors, where they identify the top risk. You have for each of them a risk register, and we will go in the weeds on how to do that maybe a bit later today. And from those top risk, from all the directors, because there are some commonalities across the directors, you roll them up and you bring them to the general counsel, the DGM, the general manager, and say, okay, those are the perceived top risk for the quarter identified by your directors. Question number one, do you recognize those risks? Question number two, do you have some new risk that you would see that would not have been captured by the tactic layer? So you can have this top-down approach I've just mentioned, or you can have the bottom-up approach that I discussed a bit earlier on. Having in mind, and again, having in mind that your organization may also decide as a step one to only deal with the operational layer. Example, asset management inherently does risk management because you are looking at the critical assets, you are looking and you have a method to calculate the criticality of those assets, which is actually risk management. Engineering, divisions, construction, pipeline, maybe regulatory services, etc., under your engineering division does risk management. By nature also because it's guided by the standard, the engineering standard and the engineering design standards. For example, you have also safety. If you have a dedicated safety division in your organization, inherently safety does risk management. So at the beginning, if you would want to start with already what exists and create a kind of platform for that, you could have the discussion on a regular basis. And again, it can be on a quarterly basis. If you want to start with, it can be twice a year. It can be on a monthly basis, depending on the size of your organization, depending on how dynamic your organization is. And you could start consolidate the top risk for each of those three divisions, for example, I've mentioned, and to have this roll-up mechanism I've just mentioned. Do you have any question? Is it clear on how it could work?
I think I'm in charge of this, like, silly, ignorant questions here. So just to reveal my ignorance. So if in an organization, you would have to have sort of certain level, would you be building maturity from the top, I mean, from the bottom up? You would, when organization starts, it would start addressing risks separately, or is there usually like a comprehensive approach to dealing with risk, across different business units?
It really it comes back to the discussion we had 2 weeks ago. It really depends on your organization and how you believe you can engage your executives, your top management in an overall enterprise risk management program. If you have a buy-in from your CEO, GM, if you have a buy-in from the directors and the executive leadership, you can start with them at the beginning. So probably, as far as they are concerned, let's imagine they've never done risk management in their life. So, right. Which was the case at WSSC Water when we started this program. So what did we do first? We did a training for them. So it was a training, what I call applied training. So what is risk management? How do we do it? And for each step that we are going to see in a moment, I was asking them to give me an example. So let's be clear. And I'm going to bring this up. Give me 1 second. So I'm going to bring this. Okay. So this is the risk management cycle, meaning that if you do risk management in your asset division, if you do risk management in your safety division, if you do risk management in your engineering division, or if you do risk management at an enterprise level, that's the risk management cycle. You will have to go through those phases in order to have a robust risk management program in place. So what do you do? First, there's the identification phase. So when you go to train your director, for example, you talk about the identification. What is the identification? Of course, it's about identifying a risk, but it's also about nominating a risk owner. So how do you identify a risk? You are using all the information available around you, and you try to project yourself and see what could go wrong. And I pause here also 1 second to tie this back to what we said 2 weeks ago. When I say risk, we talk about risk and opportunities, okay? Because both are the two sides of the same coin. So you identify your risk. So, Mr. Director, today, let's imagine he's the asset management director. Today, what is the top risk that you can see in your area? What is keeping you awake at night? And the director is going to say, I don't know, pick one. The number of critical assets is increasing because the infrastructure is aging, for example. Okay. So, Mr. Director, very good. You have identified your risk. Now, what are the causes that could trigger this risk? What are the causes that trigger exactly what you said? So it's going to say, well, there's been some budget cuts, or it's uncertain if we are going to have any rate increase, or our company is more than 100 years old. So, of course, there's very old pipes that are there. We had some operational budget cuts, so the preventive maintenance could not be fully completed, or we had some people leaving the company who had a very good expertise, so the inspection program could not be completely finished, you name it. Okay, so you have your causes here. Okay, now you have identified your causes, you have identified your risk, and what are the consequences, in my example, if this risk is materializing? So in this precise example, so what? The infrastructure is aging and you have more and more critical assets. So what? What could be the consequences of that? So the director most likely will answer something along those lines. You will have more water main break. You will have more visibility of the organization in the media because some people will have some flood issue, etc., etc. Okay, very good, very good. So here we have identified our risk. Who is the risk owner? A risk owner is somebody who is going to coordinate the activities wherever they are based inside the organization to ensure this risk is addressed. So the asset manager, in this case, may say, well, either asset management or production, for example. So let's imagine it's the production director. Okay, very good. So here what we've done is we have identified our risk, we have identified our causes, our consequences, and we have nominated a risk owner. Any question from your side at this stage?
Yeah, this is all very helpful, and I feel really bad because I think I'm really have not dealt with the risk management that much. So maybe my questions are silly. My concern expressed last time was that it seems like enterprise risk require, I just wanted to see, this is the area where I think people have maybe a little bit less exposure and experience than in other areas. Like, we've been dealing with pipes and pumps for a very long time, but dealing with risk in a structured manner with some standard methodology is not really something that I've been exposed to that much in the past. So I'm trying to see what is the on-ramp, what almost like what are the prerequisites for the class, how can we, because it seems kind of scary and big, and I'm thinking, how do we get into this?
Cello and Elaine, maybe I could just take a shot at, I think in principle, what we were really trying to make sure we were on the same page about is that we're dealing with enterprise risk. And that we weren't dealing just with project risk or operational risk or asset risk or something like that, that we were dealing with the overall enterprise risk. As you said, Elaine, you can approach it from a top-down or bottom-up standpoint. You can get there through different, in different journeys. We saw how a strategic plan context with more involvement rather than just senior leadership involvement to start with, if it was kind of a bottom-up kind of approach. In MCES, they first did operational risk, and then they went to their senior leadership team and said, okay, this is what they came up with. What else do you have? What keeps you up at night? And which of these things would rise to the top in terms of? So I think that there's not necessarily just one way to get to it, which I think you're expressing. But in the end, what we're trying to do is say, in the end, what we'd like to do, and there could be different case studies on different journeys that people take, but we're trying to get to a common, using a common framework and matrix and all of that, that we're trying to get to a risk register for the enterprise as a whole that cuts across the whole organization, that can be, like you said, monitored, reported, assessed, and so forth.
And the mechanism that I have just presented to you, taking the example for asset management and this structure, and that was just for identifying the risk.
Okay.
Is applied if you look at a project, if you look at a division. And the other day we had I don't know if Chris, you were there, I don't think you were, but we had a very interesting discussion with Jessica, where Jessica brought up a topic, and we used this topic really to apply exactly what we said. So Chris, without putting you in the spotlight, you are working in asset management, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So in asset management, Chris, today, what are you looking at?
What am I looking at in terms of the asset base, or in terms of risks?
In terms, both of them are connected, because if you look at the asset, I'm kind of almost intuitively sure that you're looking at also a piece of risk in your assets, right?
Right. No, what I meant by is that we have a wide range of asset class, per se, that we try to prioritize and focus on one thing over the other. And also in a parallel stream, we look at the risk assessment of a certain asset. Like, for example, our linear assets, like the sewer and water lines.
Yeah.
We're trying to map out the risk profile for the entire network. So that's one sort of stream that I'm working on. Another stream would be writing up a condition assessment framework for wastewater treatment plants.
Yeah.
So there are multiple things that I'm working on, but yeah, I totally agree with you that anything that I sort of try to focus on is sort of go back to the risk concept and looking at the consequence of failure if that happens, right?
Yeah. So I imagine that the way we identify a risk, and again, I've picked an example out of the blue, well, not completely out of the blue, but I've picked an example, is the approach I've mentioned for your day-to-day business is similar to what you're doing, Chris, for example, like for the identification piece?
Yeah, totally right. All the activities that we're doing, either that's a condition related or risk itself, they're like all intertwined, right?
Yeah.
Like condition feeds into the likelihood of failure of the risk profile, and all that. But I guess one sort of challenges that we're having is, we don't have a good sort of fundamental risk register for our organizations. and we need to start sort of developing that. But to do that, like as you and Scott mentioned, there's different sort of approaches, right? Top down versus bottom up, and different sort of divisions under different directors would have different appetite to the risks. And I guess the challenging part would be having the sort of the consistent framework that can be used across the board, so that when the risk is identified and assessed to a certain score, it can be objectively compared and prioritized between different things. And also, if we do this sort of bottom up from different divisions, how do we ensure that, or maybe it's not important to ensure that, but how do we ensure to make sure we don't sort of duplicate some of the risks that are identified and managed in different departments, divisions rather, and the mitigation strategy can be sort of optimized? I don't know if that makes sense.
Very good question, Chris. Very good question. I'm going to answer to the second part. For the first part, which was about the risk register, and in my mind, it's what I call the artifact. Nothing today is refraining you in your sphere with your team, in your, I don't know if you lead a division or a section or whatever, but whatever is your unit, nothing is refraining you for having a risk register with what you're dealing with and putting the risk that you have here. And again, I mean, I don't know if Cello shared with you my presentation, and there's, again, several ways of doing it, but let me bring this to you. So this is, well, we have it risk-based, Chris, at WSSC Water, but before we develop this tool internally, which is, again, very simple. I know that in public utilities, developing an IT tool might be a heavy lift, but here again, I mean, it took us with my colleague like 3 months to put it there. But you can have it on an Excel spreadsheet to start with. And what do you have here? You have your risk number. Here, it's a barbarism, which is RBS, risk breakdown structure, which is actually your risk universe, meaning what is the nature of your risk? Is it a financial risk? Is it an operational risk? Is it a reputational risk? That's where you would put here. Here, something that you recognize because we just talked about it, the cause that trigger your risk. And I can explain why we do it like that. The description of your risk, meaning what is your risk? In my example a moment ago, aging infrastructure, the number of critical assets that are failing. I think that was the risk I brought up. The impacts that we can call consequences. The risk owner, and we've talked about it. And here you have your probability score, and we can talk more in depth about that, your severity score, and the multiplication of the P by the S is giving you the risk profile, right? Which by nature shows you, and here it was a conditional formatting on Excel, it shows you by nature that if it's red, it's your priority. So it's, I would say, a no-brainer here, right? Then you have the response, the treatment, the progress. We are going to see that a bit later. Just want to come back on why do we describe the cause and why do we describe the impact. It's called, by the way, a bow tie approach. So you know it. It's because when we are going to devise the mitigation strategies being about addressing, controlling the causes and reducing the impact, when you have all your causes and your impacts laid down, obviously it's easier to find some solutions. That's why. But that's, before we develop this IT tool, that's the risk register that we had. So very simple, like you have 6, 7, I have not counted, columns that really provide a framework and a structure. And that's the risk register that you revisit every month, every quarter, depending on the frequency that you have. Okay.
So is this, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay, so Is this just the risk register for one division in WSSC, or is this something that was bought in by the entire organizations and by directors, and they understand what what all these means and with a way to measure these scores?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, the first session I ever had with the directors, and I would say 95% of them had never been. I've never been approached with risk management. They've never did that in their life. Okay, I just explained them the risk management cycle, as I did just now for the identification, taking an example and filling this risk register in front of them during the training / applied training session to tell them what it looks like. Now, to answer the second piece of your question, every director in my organization, in our organization, every director has his own risk register. The general counsel has his own risk register. Each DGM's deputy general manager have their own risk register. Okay, and the company, for the company, I'm making a report. Okay, which is a combination of all the risk register of all the. It's just for a matter of visual thing, but all what's in there could be also in a risk register. Okay. Now to the second piece of your question, which is very interesting. The second piece of your question was, how do we make sure we do not have duplicates? Disregarding if you do a bottom-up or top-down approach, you will have many divisions, many stakeholders across the organization who are going to report the same risk with different words. With different words, but the content of that risk will be the same. I'm going to take a practical example here. If we are talking about human resources, you might have your human resources team that is going to say, we have a lot of retiree, we have an aging workforce, so the succession is going to be difficult. You have maybe your director of production who is going to tell you, I'm really struggling to fill the vacant position with experienced people. You may have, etc., etc. So those various, that same risk that is expressed in different way, that's the role of the enterprise risk manager to look across all the risk registers and say, okay, this one is the same risk. So combining all the elements from all of them, what could be the umbrella top risk, if you will? Okay. So in my example, it could be availability of expertise and resources may be challenging within the next 5 years, for example. Okay. So the duplicate, yes, exists, but your role, and that's why it becomes also an enterprise risk, it's because many people in the organization have identified this risk as a key concern, that it's surfaced up as a strategic risk or as an enterprise risk in the organization.
I'm starting to get it after all these years that Ellen, so that's very encouraging, because if I get it, everybody else is already very familiar with it. So I think back to Chris's question,
yes.
There would need to be then some consistency in the format of that people are using, because otherwise the enterprise risk manager couldn't really connect the dots. Is that an accurate statement?
But that's also the role of your enterprise risk manager to create the tools that are in the company's toolbox in order to be able to do risk management. And here I've shown you a risk register. There's plenty of format. I'm a fervent advocate of keep it simple, above all at the beginning, okay? So you have some companies who have very sophisticated risk register with 50 columns and blah. No, what you want to really to focus on is really make sure your risks are identified and your risks are mitigated, which leads me to the second question that you had, Chris, about your question was about, I think, making sure the risks are taken care of. Okay, example. You, as the, let's say, the director of asset management, you have engaged all your section leaders, for example, all of them have a risk register, okay? You look at the top risk for each of your section manager, you will find some that are common, right? And let's say that you pick one that is common to all of them, a big one, right? Of course, a big one. And this risk, and I come back to my example I took about asset management and the risk of failure or the number of critical assets who are increasing. In order to address this risk, you will probably need to have at the table production, engineering, inspection. I'm not sure how your organization is structured. So here again, there are several ways of doing it. Okay, so either you believe your colleagues in your organization are well versed already in risk management and in addressing them, and you could go cold turkey and say, we are making a small working group and we are going to focus, cross-functional working group, and we are going to focus all together on addressing this group, this risk. Or your organization is not mature, and then you are going to start devising a couple of smart mitigation strategies, things that are low-hanging fruit, maybe, that you have there. And you are going to talk, for example, to your engineering colleague and say, okay, here, you know, I have my asset management plan, and those are my top 5 critical assets, right? And I know that you guys, you do some inspection on some assets here, but I'm under the impression that there's a disconnect where you do the inspection and where my critical assets are. So can we be around the table and kind of align or make sure that we try to have this inspection program also covering the critical assets, so we have some information back? And again, I'm picking examples out of the blue that might not be realistic for your organization, right? But just to put some content in what I'm saying. So that's what you could do.
So, oh, I'm sorry. So, Elaine, I'm just also looking at the clock here, but and thinking ahead a little bit. But one, I think getting feedback from people, does this make sense to people? And then the other thing is, in terms of your own approach, are you in a position, I mean, it could be maybe for next time, to describe, you know, what you see as an approach within your organization to move towards, you know, this, an enterprise risk type of model, and you could present that, or at least the outline of it, and then you get some feedback on that. I'm just thinking ahead to, you know, how we progress this.
No, sure, Scott, sure. And you could also bring your org chart, and I mean, we are super lucky because we are a small group. So we could really use your org chart to see where it's done already and where it could be done to start with in the organization. And we could even design how potentially it could be done with the little tweaks here and there, depending on the size and the maturity of your organization. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Chris, for example, was talking about asset classes. You know, so one way is to deal with the part of the organization. The other is a cross-functional kind of group that deals with different categories of assets. That being just one input, really, to an overall enterprise risk management plan.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Scott. Yeah.
Sorry.
To the question that Scott raised, up to now and what we discussed, does it make sense?
Yeah, I think we have a raised hand, Rick.
Rick?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm more familiar with Zoom. I don't know how to raise a hand electronically. Yeah, so one to Helene's first question, or Scott's question, it totally makes sense for us when what we're doing. And we can put a quick presentation together for, the next cycle to kind of show where we're at, what we're doing, what the challenges that we have. Mm-hmm. And we've got, it's interesting because we're doing it from a departmental level. So we've got board, we've got what we call a CPC, but that's the CAO and their direct reports. And we report to one of those direct reports. And we have a strategic plan from the board, but it's this weird thing that just appears out of, we're not sure where. So we almost have to reverse engineer what the action, we get actions out of that, and we have to reverse engineer what the board understood were the risks. And at the same time, we've got a number of people that understand their risks at the grassroots level, let's say, and people intuitively understand their risks, but they can't intuitively describe them or put them down anywhere. So what you're talking about makes just a ton of sense. And so we're trying to convince the corporation that we do need a risk register. We've been talking about it for quite a while, but got no traction. And I think you mentioned it before, by the way, Cello, your recordings are brilliant. They work perfectly well. And so our risk manager, what we call our corporate risk manager, is our insurance coordinator for everything. So, but we have a really good opportunity where Chris is just moving from working for me in Liquid Waste Services to a centralized group that's going to be doing asset management overview and our asset management office, a centralized asset management office. So we'll be able to start to pull this stuff together.
So Jessica, what about you?
So I have some thoughts on this too, and I get really excited every time we have this conversation. I get really motivated. I need to start taking some more action and kind of put that to work. But I'm similar to Chris, and my focus on asset management right now. And I think one of the challenges we're dealing with is just given the age of our system, we're just now kind of reaching that stage of really thinking about rehab and replacement very seriously. And I've been trying to figure out how I wanted to approach this in the organization. And I'm actually thinking of using this framework to kind of help facilitate those conversations, because there's the data analysis part on my side with our team in asset management, but there's also that conversation piece. And I've been trying to figure out how I want to work this, and I've been doing a lot of brainstorming lately. But I'm kind of thinking starting kind of bottom up, but running my ideas by the top before I start at the bottom to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. So like I'm looking at getting together, maybe starting in the operations and maintenance department, which is going to be the focus of all of our assets, and getting small groups together to meet regularly with asset management to talk about those top risk rehab issues that we know of or what's coming up, and really thinking about, what the problems are and how they can be addressed so we can make sure we've got projects planned long term. And I'm thinking if I use, Lynn's, your approach and, putting together a similar sort of matrix that's simple, and I agree, I'm like a very simple is better. When it gets too complicated, I just, just, it loses me. But, I'm thinking of maybe setting out some sort of matrix and then starting with sort of our, I guess, organization top level, which I think similar to Rick with the, kind of more focused on insurance, but still kind of starting with that individual, maybe running this framework by him and just saying, this is what I think I'm going to do for operations and maintenance to start with our assets. Do you see any conflicts? Do you see this as something that in the future, should it get expanded across the organization, would this align with your expectations? So maybe that'll get them thinking about an enterprise risk register a little bit more, but more of, I'm just going to do this. I'm not expecting your help right now, but I'm going to try it out, but getting their buy-in on the approach so that at least I'm not headed in some crazy direction that's not going to be compatible with their needs in the future. So I that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm rambling a bit, but that's, you know, kind of what I'm thinking might be the best way to
Cool.
start in our group. But
Cool.
yeah,
And,
I get excited. I love hearing this. Your approach is awesome. So yeah,
and,
be good.
and actually, risk management is really a support to a decision-making process. You have a decision to make. In your example, you said we need to replace the asset. Well, I'm saying, well, that's when you do risk management, you're always playing the devil's advocate, right?
Yeah.
Well, that might be jumping to a conclusion. First, you want to know what asset we are talking about, what would be the cost of that, what would be the risk associated with replacing your assets, how is your capital investment program going to inflate in terms of dollar value, how your debt ratio is going to inflate or not, is it within the appetite set, and what are the capabilities of your engineering, inspection, maintenance, people, staff here, because at the end of the day, when you look at all those parameters and you have identified the risk and the opportunities for those two options, meaning replacing and or upgrading or repairing, whatever that is, maybe what would come to play would not be replacing, which was the first, let's say, impression, right?
Right.
So risk and opportunities will support the analysis of those two options, in my example, Jessica. So, and again, it's what I've just mentioned, and we have only 10 minutes left, but what I just mentioned to Chris a moment ago, your risk register template, and again, I can send you the presentation, or Cello can do that because as it whoever. I mean, is an example of what you could do. You can even slash some columns, right? So you would have your risk register. Then indeed you have a matrix, and also on my presentation there's WSSC water matrix. Your matrix can be adjusted, meaning the threshold of the matrix can be adjusted. The matrix, I mean, also can be adjusted. I know some CEOs, they are using a 2x2. Some other people are using a 3x3. Some others are using a 6x6. I find that a 5x5 is a good practice because it avoids, depending on the threshold you've designed, that people basically answer the I don't know slot, if you see what I mean, because you want people to position. What is your perception on that risk? Do you see it high, not high, why? And by kind of, and that's the role of your risk manager, whoever your risk manager is really to ask those questions that are sometimes the elephant in the room, that are kind of bothering people. So you put the prerequisite, you say, okay, I'm going to challenge you here. I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. But you ask those questions and you try to extract from people's mind really how high is the risk. And that's the assessment part, okay? So you have different, if you have your risk matrix, if you have your risk register, you're good to go. I mean, not at an enterprise level, maybe because it would mean that everybody does that and you have somebody who is kind of overall coordinating all that, right? But at least you can do it in your area. You can do it in your area. And if it's successful, when you're going to see your boss after, and your boss is going to say, okay, you've made me some recommendation about this and this and this. Okay, where are the data? Where are the metrics that are supporting your recommendation? And where this is coming from? So in addition to all the research, the analysis you've done based on data from your tools, you will have your risk register and say, look, I mean, amongst my colleagues, this is amongst the top 3 risks identified. So it's.
So I think, I mean, I noticed that Doug Stewart left the meeting he was on earlier and didn't have comments. Craig Edlund from MCES went through, it sounds like what you're doing, Jessica, which was they had each of the facilities, basically the operational facilities, they got them all together in a room. They did basically a risk identification and risk, assessment, and then and came out with a product which ultimately went to, it was a bottom-up approach, but it wound up going up to their executive team, and some of those risks were identified as leading risks. And I don't know if Craig would have time to do a quick overview, but that would be an example, or whether you separately contact him, I think that that's an example. And they've also gotten into kind of a asset category kind of approach as well, like Chris was talking about. So I think that there's a lot to be learned from people on the team, but I can check to see if Craig might be willing, Elaine, just to spend 10 minutes to just give a real live example of what they were able to do as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, not a problem. And if we push it also in that line. So one thing also I want to kind of you will hear me say that very often. Risk management is not a one shot type of exercise. It needs a continuous monitoring.
Yep.
Meaning that, and I actually, if there's one thing that anybody has to remember about risk management, it's this one. Meaning that what you have identified one day in a room with some people, with the information you had at that moment in time, may not be true the moment after. That's why it's a continuous process. So, I mean, you don't have to do it every day, of course, but that's why when I talk about project, I say, well, every month is good. When you talk about divisions or directors, a quarter is good enough. When you talk about the plants and the depots, depending on how dynamic they are, maybe every quarter or twice a year would be enough. Depends on your organization, but that's the kind of idea. But it needs a constant monitoring for a few things. To make sure that the risks identified are still valid, because the circumstances might have changed. So the risk might not exist any longer, or risk which was in a green zone or orange zone might have become in a red zone risk because of those circumstances and some other elements. But also to monitor the progress on the mitigation strategies. Imagine each mitigation strategy as a small project, really, with a team that is really working in practice operationally on addressing this risk. Because if you work on that mitigation strategy and that mitigation strategy was smart, obviously that's the only way, circumstances remaining equal, it's the only way to decrease your risk profile. So this is really what you want to monitor. And also to share with you, at WSSC Water, actually, the enterprise risk management program is feeding into the strategic plan. How? We have the, like everybody, there's no mystery to the strategic plan. You have the strategic plan, you have the strategic priorities, then you have the strategic initiatives. And the strategic initiatives are for a good number of them, are a direct copy and paste, I would say almost, from mitigation strategies addressing the top risk for the company.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I think that it's a great, the nice thing about this being a fairly small group is that I think our way of working could be maybe a little bit more tight. So a couple of things that we have discussed, the first one is kind of sharing some materials, and what I'm showing, I hope you can see it, and this is where it is in OneDrive. It's under Improvement Initiatives, Enterprise Risk, and then there's a folder for each of the utilities participating. So you can just click on your folder, and you will then be able to see what others have posted. So I think as you go and work in your own individual things, these materials, to be able to see what others have posted, what others are doing would be really great. Hélène has been gracious enough to post something already. So that's the first thing. And the second one is for the next call. It would be really wonderful if Metro Vancouver could maybe take a bit of time, go through to describe what they're doing, what they'd like to do, and stuff like that. And there would be an opportunity to have a sounding board, and then the meeting after that, maybe Jessica could kind of talk about what kind of things she plans to do, and kind of get feedback from others. I think that that would be very very useful. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so you can also find these folders through Microsoft Teams. If you have any trouble finding it, let me know. I've spent 4 hours on calls with Microsoft in the last week, Microsoft support, because some things were not doing quite as well as I had hoped. But I think you will be able to post materials, download, upload, and stuff like that. Any other questions? Because it's 29 after the hour.
In preparing the what we're going to put together, is there anyone that I could chat with just to bounce some thoughts off of?
I'm certainly available, and Scott is going to be available. So if you'd like, just send us, and Hélène may be available as well. We're such a small group, so just send us an email and say, I'd like to bounce some ideas. We can schedule whether it's 30 minutes or an hour, whatever. I think that this collaborative part is quite a valuable aspect of this exercise.
Yeah, and the same thing, if you would want to try to send what I call testing balloons in your organization, I'm happy to send you the tools that we have at WSSC Water, such as a risk register or others. And again, you can adjust it. You add one column, you remove one column. It's going to be in Excel to start with. But more than the tool, it's putting people in the mindset of doing it. And you can start that. So, I mean, bottom line is you can reach me if I can be of any help kicking off what you're trying to do.
That'd be
so
great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, we have every couple of weeks these kind of, I don't want to call it formal, but regular meetings, but we can meet at any time to be each other's sounding board and help and stuff like that. It's not as logistically complicated. Some groups that have like 15 or 18 people.
Okay, sounds good.
And we are lucky we are working for public entities, so we do not have confidentiality issues that you have in private companies and other kind of things. So.
Well, I want to be respectful of everybody. Thank you, everybody, for discussion. Thank Hélène for another lesson, and apologies for being a slow student in the class. But that person also has a role. So everybody have a great day, and we'll just reach out anytime you have a question or a concern.
Bye bye.
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.